we're going to spend the evening with Mkhitar Gosh, a person who lived from around 1130 to 1213, mostly in the far northeast corner of Armenia, not exactly an international hotspot from our kind of Western-centric point of view. So the question arises. Up here it says, Mkhitar Gosh, how to be an Armenian in a multicultural world. What did he know about multicultural things? What did he know or experience about multicultural living way up there in the frozen north? And I want to spend our time together this evening answering that question in two parts. For the first part, I would like us to look at who he was and who he became and how he became who he became. Then secondly, I would like us to look at the principles for multicultural living that he distilled from his lifetime of experience. So first, we're going to begin with Mkhitar. Who was he? How did he become who he became? But before we even begin to talk about Mkhitar at all as the quite remarkable individual that he was, I want to show you something. Gansak is here. All right? I want you to keep that in mind as we go on just a little bit. This is where Mkhitar was born, in Ganja. I want you to keep your eye on that spot as I change the map and look at it now. Well, the green pieces, the Shaddadids, are ethnic Kurds who happen to control this area at this time. The province of Khachen, sitting right below Ganja, is ruled by another dynastic family called the Jalalians, who were begun by their leader, who was Armenian, named Hassan Jalal. To the east, you have a province called Sharvan, which is ruled by Seljuk Turks. To the north, you have Georgia, as you pointed out, ruled by Bagradunis, who, as you probably already know, were once part of an Armenian clan. Armenia doesn't exist in this time period as a political entity with boundaries. So where are the Armenians? Very good. They're all over the place. They're inside all of those other entities. And this map is the world of Mkhitar's childhood. This is the world that he grew up in. This is 1150 probably. 1140, 1150. All right? Now, hold this picture in your mind with the little green strips and the other things around, and Georgia sitting up on the top, and then let's look again at this map, very different. This is the world of Mkhitar's mature age and his elder years. Ganja is right where it was, but what's different? What's changed? Where are our little green Shaddadids? They're gone. They're not there. What's there instead? What else has changed before we get to what's there instead? What else has changed on this map?
Fewer colors.
Fewer colors, bigger blocks. Okay. What else has changed? What color is Georgia on this map? It's kind of a grayish, peachy thing, yeah? How big is it? It starts here. It goes here. It goes up to here, out to here.
Including the peachy stuff?
Including some of the peachy stuff, yeah. So where Georgia used to be sitting right here, Georgia is now wrap around. It's doubled its size. Big change for everybody. Our little Shaddadids are gone. The Georgians are huge. What happened to the little states like Khachen and Bakh? They're dissolved. They're not there anymore. What about Azerbaijan? It's gotten smaller. And it now has a different ruler, the Ildigizids. Changes. What would it be like to live in a landscape that changes like this over the course of your lifetime? And what has happened to all of those Shaddadid people and to all of those Seljuk Turks who used to be living there, in charge? Where are they now? No. Someone is a dreamer. They're still there. Just like the Armenians are still there, even though things have changed in the power structure. And I don't think that you can read the writing, but within that big orange area around Lake Sevan, where Ganja is located, there are lots of names with no boundaries. Hasan Jalalyank, Vakhtankyank, Khakhbakyank, Brosyank, Shirvan Shahanid. All of them areas under the control of clans who have power depending on their strength at the moment and their ability to network with other local players. There are unofficial entities, in other words, within the official entities, within what used to be Armenia. So the maps tell us that Mkhitar did know a thing or two about living in a shifting cultural landscape. He grew up in a jumble of Christians, Georgians, Armenians, and Muslims, and probably Jews also, in every possible imaginable combination and permutation of power and relationship between them. As a child, he probably also witnessed some of the very horrible consequences of intercultural disharmony. In one manuscript colophon, in a kind of a PS at the end, in other words, he very vividly describes a terrible earthquake that took place when he was a young boy in the year 1139 in his hometown of Ganjak. And he describes how thousands of dwellings, together with their inhabitants, disappeared into huge fissures that opened in the surface of the earth, something like this one, perhaps. And even worse, if that wasn't bad enough, to hear people screaming from under the ground, he recounts that subsequently, the traumatized and vulnerable survivors were pillaged and enslaved by a succession of Muslim and then Christian Georgian armies. Not a pretty picture. And the effect of this callous and predatory behavior on the people of the region who had to go on living side by side can only be imagined. Mkhitar knew the dark side of multicultural living. And intercultural diversity, when he would speak about it later, he obviously could speak about it in depth, but that wasn't all that he based his principles for living in a multicultural world upon. Mkhitar also lived in very paradoxical times. It was a very strange world. There was no Armenian state in Armenia, but there was an Armenian state not in Armenia. And that introduced a whole level of new multicultural complexity into Mkhitar's experience of life. When this man, Levon the Great, was finally crowned as king of Armenian Cilicia in the year 1198, he presided over a society of Armenian refugees, Armenian adventurers, Greeks, Syrians, assorted Muslims, as well as French, Belgian, and Italian crusaders and their offspring, to use the modern names for the countries they came from. And Levon himself married European wives, as did the rest of his clan, when they weren't wedding Muslims or Byzantines. Very diverse society. Now, all of this cultural diversity taking place in Cilicia would have had no effect on Mkhitar at all if it hadn't been for one very strange thing, one psychological/spiritual thing. Armenian monks within the various political entities of the homeland, all of those colored areas that we saw, were looked upon by the population, and they also looked upon themselves as the spiritual and to some extent also the physical guardians of the Armenian homeland region and of its ethos. The purity of their life and the purity of their faith was widely felt to safeguard the region inhabited by Armenians, not against assimilation, but against the ever-present dangers from conflict and natural disasters. The monks, the clergy, the vartabeds constituted a kind of energy shield, so to speak, maintaining a blanket of Armenian faith over the soil of the Armenian homeland. They were, in a way, caretaking that faith and its spiritual power for better times when hopefully the country would revive. Now, perhaps they were all right about that. But in Mkhitar's days, two of Armenia's most splendid and most revered and most intellectually powerful monasteries, Harbat and Sanahin, were especially noted for their zeal in this task of preserving Armenian tradition as they understood it from external influences, maintaining the Armenian faith and way of life unsullied. Within their overall agenda of protecting their region, these northern Armenian vartabeds cultivated a conservative and very inward-focused stance towards Armenian Christianity. And they were profoundly disturbed by what they saw as the insane and dangerous readiness of Armenians in Cilicia, not just to compromise, but also to cohabit with Roman Catholics and Byzantines. A kind of a spiritual xenophobia was produced, for lack of a better word. There's probably something better I could call it, but that's all that comes to mind. And assisted by some very unfortunate personalities who were deeply invested in very conflicting agendas. All of this feeling of the need to protect the homeland opened a rift between Armenians in the northern areas and Armenians in Cilicia. And we don't need to go into the details here, fascinating though they are. But this intracultural chasm between the two biggest Armenian populations is what formed Mkhitar's education. Because Mkhitar trained under the preeminent vartabed of his region, a man named Hovannes Tavushetsi. And becoming Hovannes's disciple in this conservative tradition also meant that Mkhitar joined his peripatetic teacher on his many traveling, preaching, and teaching tours throughout the region. And just accompanying his teacher gave him a very detailed understanding of the diversity within the diversity of his region. He got to see everyone everywhere and how they interacted and what they needed to know. When Mkhitar began his studies with Hovannes, we really don't know, but it might have been after he was ordained a priest rather than before. Mkhitar often did things a little bit backwards, as we will see. And becoming a vartabed, a teacher, is always a lengthy process in Armenian tradition. We don't know exactly how long it took Mkhitar to be granted the staff that was the visible insignium of his teaching certification, but it was probably at least a decade of study. This would put him sort of conjecturally, if we want to guesstimate it, somewhere in his middle 30s when he reached the shining moment of graduation. The moment when, in his prime, Mkhitar should have taken off into a stellar career. He might very well have reasonably looked forward to, succeeding his famous teacher as the preeminent intellectual of his region and becoming a leading light in the Armenian intellectual and spiritual world, instead of rising to the prominence that he richly deserved. Mkhitar, who, as I said just a minute ago, did things backwards, put away his diploma, left his coveted teaching staff in a closet someplace, and set out for Cilicia in order to discover the other face of Armenian learning, the dark side, if you will. What possessed him to do this? at the start of a promising career and just kind of give it all up, we have no idea. But he not only went to Cilicia, that bastion of dangerous compromise, but he also went to the most ecumenical, the most compromised, the most dangerous enclave of learning in Cilicia, Sevler, which was really a group of mountains dotted with monastic institutions that belonged to Greeks, Syrians, Roman Catholics, and Armenians, not to mention that it was home also to a huge number of hermits of all kinds of persuasions. And when he got there, Mkhitar, crazy lunatic that he was, did not tell anyone that he had a degree from Armenia. Instead, he started over. He wanted to learn it all again, from a different point of view, with a beginner's mind, as they say these days. And so when he would often say later in life, and as we'll see in a little bit, that humility is the greatest of all the multicultural virtues, he knew what he was talking about. Well, obviously, with his background, Mkhitar must have been a stellar student, but he never told anyone why. And he went through the entire Vartabed program, and remember, it took years to go through it. Presumably, he got fluent in West Armenian, and he will have let his classmates tease him about his accent and his funny little beard, which is why he's named Gosh, and the fact that he was older than all of his classmates. He went through all of this, he took all the examinations, was certified again to teach matters of Armenian faith. It's really interesting how life works out. Although he lived his career backwards, Mkhitar had, in a funny way, perfect timing. Because it may well be that while he was studying on Sevler, the famous, and in the homeland infamous, ecumenist Nersess Armenian came there looking for manuscripts. Mkhitar, being in Cilicia at the time that he was, experienced the benevolent reigns of Katoigos Krikor Pahlavuni, his brother Nersess Shnorali, and their nephew Krikor Dera. In other words, Mkhitar happened to be in Cilician Armenia in the heyday of its spiritual and intellectual achievements. And thus, he became the first person to combine in one heart and one mind the best of both the conservative North and the cosmopolitan South, the inward-looking North and the outward-looking South, the best of both worlds of Armenian spiritual and intellectual disciplines. It was almost like having two natures incarnate in a single being, with a wonderful dose of good humor thrown in, and a very winsome way that he had with people at all levels of society. I wish it were possible, but it's not in our time frame, to do justice to the story of how Mkhitar finally got himself back from Cilicia to his homeland as he was pushing 50. It's a fantastic, almost unbelievable tale of chance meetings, mishaps, fateful tragedies, rejection by peers and superiors that turned out in hindsight to be part of some incredible divine plan to buy time for unexpected reversals of fortune to take place. In the end, Mkhitar got the great career. He got the opportunity to build his own monastery on a lovely piece of real estate near a sweet lake with a village, and gradually with enough income-bearing property to become self-supporting. This is what his monastery looks like now. We have no pictures of what it looked like when he built it, because when he built it, it was wood. In his inscriptions, recorded by one of his students, he speaks of himself as Mkhitar the carpenter. Somebody said a thoughtful word back there. Over his years in this monastery, he worked together with the community to gradually replace the wooden structures with stone. First, they replaced the wooden church of Krikor Lusavoric with the stone church of Surpastva Zadzin. And then, just before he died in 1213, he built a jamadun with a wooden library on top of it, later replaced by a stone structure and attached to the church. In 1213, the then 80-year-old, give or take, Mkhitar, was buried overlooking the monastic complex so that his spiritual presence could continue to oversee and presumably also to enjoy its process of future growth. Mkhitar was not the abbot of this monastery, nor kedik, as it was called. He left that job with its prestige and its headaches to a succession of his students, Vartan, Hovanes, Mardiros. He himself was very much in demand for other things. He was in demand as a teacher. He was in demand as the spiritual director of the local prince. He was in demand as advisor to the local secular authorities. There were family feuds and incredibly tangled controversies between princes and clerics that he had to mediate. The Catholicos Grigordera commissioned him to write. There were just too many things to be done for Mkhitar to worry about the prominence of his position. Being Mkhitar Hussein was good enough. That, in a very small nutshell, is who Mkhitar was. Multiple times a multicultural man. So out of his lifetime of experiences, backwards, forwards, with all kinds of people, what principles did Mkhitar distill? What did he pass on to his students as the essence of his wisdom about how to live in such a world, and pass on through his students to generation upon generation of Armenian spiritual and intellectual teachers, down into the 20th century and now beyond that? What principles did he give them to guide them as they navigated their own multicultural lives? Mkhitar's 3 principles, that's all there are, 3 principles for multicultural living are simple, deceptively simple. The first one is this: to live well interculturally, you need to live well intraculturally. To put it another way, the more harmonious you live with the people who are like you, the better a skill set you will have for living with the people who aren't. Mkhitar explained this principle to his spiritual son, Prince Zakare Zakarian Yergaina Pazuk, who lived in a cultural quandary. He was Lusavorchagan. His brother and fellow prince, Ivane, was Chalcedonian. That's bad enough. But Chalcedonians, especially Chalcedonian Georgians, in this time period had very unpleasant things to say about Armenians and their faith and their habits and their customs, and sometimes it went beyond words, and that was really difficult. So what was Zakare supposed to do with his brother? How were they supposed to get along? Mkhitar wrote a letter addressed to both brothers. Discord is a team sport, after all. And in it he laid out both Chalcedonian and Lusavorchagan faith and practice, and he showed the differences between them, the historical reasons for the differences, and in effect, he told the brothers, if you want to take the frustration out of your relationship, then you need to know who you are. He told them, ignorance is your enemy. If you don't know who you are and why you do what you do, then you're very easily going to be made to feel bad about yourself. Because whether they understand what you do or not, there are plenty of people out there who will be all too happy to tell you why you're wrong or deficient or why their way is better, and you just may believe them. If, on the other hand, you know who you are, you will value yourself, your traditions, your history, and your faith. And you will respect your Armenian Chalcedonian brother's faith as well, because you can be who you are without defensiveness about who he is. That last phrase, without defensiveness, is very important to Mkhitar, and he unpacked it in the last part of his letter to Zohrab and Ervine. After he delivers a pretty scathing critique of certain Chalcedonian positions and contrasts them with what he thinks are much better Armenian alternatives, Mkhitar suddenly flips the coin on Zohrab and says, the other side of knowing who you are is knowing that sometimes you may be wrong. He says to Ervine and Zohrab, okay, now let's look at some of the things where Armenians are open to criticism, rightly, by Chalcedonians. And galling though it may be, we should listen when they tell us we're off base. After all, Mkhitar concludes, we are all a mix of qualities. Let me read you how he describes some of it. Armenians are not submissive to their primates. Does that sound familiar? However, they are exceptionally charitable, especially to captives and to the clergy, and they love holy things. Georgians are aggressive and aggravating. However, they honor the saints and godparent relationships, and they never speak ill of their bishops. Syrians are humble and ascetic. Roman Catholics are always ready to drop to their knees and pray. Greeks are wise and compassionate. Remember that he lived in Sevler. He knew all these people. In short, he tells the dissenting brothers, if you want to live together peacefully in your divided family, remember one tiny little parable. It's only like a verse and a half that Jesus tells to his disciples when they are asking about the kingdom of God, and they want to know why God doesn't simply enforce uniformity now and tell us what he likes. Does anyone happen to know what this verse says? It says, the kingdom of heaven is like a net that people threw into the sea. And it gathered up every kind of fish. As well as knowing and valuing who you are, realize that even though you are mostly wonderful, you can take criticism when necessary without feeling that it threatens your identity, and you can embrace the whole range of diversity within identity. And in fact, Mkhitar makes that his second principle for multicultural living. If you want to live well in a multicultural world, he says, you must realize that diversity is divine. It's part of the divine plan, that everyone is different. If the Old Testament story of the Tower of Babel tells us anything, he told his spiritual children, it tells us that God loves diversity. After all, what did he do at the Tower of Babel? He took people who spoke a perfectly good, primal language that they all understood, and he divided it, deliberately creating multiple languages out of that one original tongue. And Mkhitar goes on to extol the infinite creativity of God, who has worked to provide us in one another with a whole panoply of beautiful differences between peoples. In other words, God has given us human beings an infinite array of qualities from which we can pick and choose. We can hone them and learn them, enjoy them, and take delight in them. He did not intend for us to strive towards uniformity, only towards harmony. Mkhitar says to these young brothers, even unity may be out of reach, but harmony never is. Mkhitar was also very clear about his third principle for multicultural living. If you want to live interculturally and do it well, live the life of Christ among your neighbors, whoever they happen to be. And for Mkhitar, living the life of Christ meant basically living the Beatitudes. Do the things that make human beings truly happy. Particularly, he said, pay attention to the first beatitude. Anyone recollect the first of the Beatitudes? I hear a bunch of blesseds. Blessed are the poor in spirit, which in Armenian comes out, blessed are the humble in heart, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Mkhitar elaborated on this principle in great detail in the most famous of his works, his law code, his Tadastanakirk. And one could, and in fact at St. Nersess we do sometimes, teach a whole course just on that code and what it says about the Armenian Christian witness to justice in daily life. But fortunately for us, Mkhitar also built this principle into a much more accessible and smaller piece of writing, one of his teaching fables. As a teacher, he knew that people will remember a story much longer than they will remember a treatise. And so here is the story that he chose to illustrate. It's one of several, humility. I want you to listen to it, and I want you to think about what this story says about humility. A wood pigeon demolished a turtle dove's nest and built its own nest there instead. Now, have any of you ever seen a dove's nest? What does it look like? I used to have a mating pair of doves that would come and use my windowsill to build their home every spring. And every spring they would come, and suddenly this little pile of assorted stuff, maybe 6 or 7 pieces of grass, would appear. And they would all around it, and then they would lay their eggs, and they were so ecstatic. It was just wonderful. And the wind would come. It would always be March. Why they do this in March, I don't know. The wind would come, there would be a storm, they would have to fly away because they're on an exposed windowsill, and as soon as they were gone, whoop, so were those 6 little pieces of straw and all of their eggs. And they did this 1 year, and then the next year, and then the next year. They're not great architects. 6 little pieces of grass is not going to get your eggs very far. So, this is what he's talking about. A wood pigeon demolishes this poor little turtle dove nest, this little pile of grass. And the 2 of them went to the stork for a trial. And there they insulted each other and they sang their own praises. The turtle dove said, well, I am sensible and religious. And the wood pigeon, I can fast for 40 days and I often do. And the one observed the other's hypocrisy, and the other one stated that his antagonist had unjustly eaten the fruits of his labor. And the judge was very severe with both of them. The stork asked the wood pigeon, why did you destroy that nest? And the wood pigeon said, because I saw no sign of intentional structure there at all, and so I appropriated it. The judge inquired again, did you put together the things that you confiscated? No. Were there or were there not at least 2 pieces of straw placed on top of each other? There were, Your Honor. The judge then ordered that the nest be returned to the turtle dove, and that in addition, a fine should be paid. According to this story, what then is Christian humility? That Christian quality that, according to Mkhitar, is essential for creating harmonious multicultural living. What is humility? He made these stories not to be simple, and yet to be very meaningful. What do these birds do to one another when they get to court? Yeah, they blame each other, they praise themselves. The one who destroyed the other's nest casts aspersions on his building techniques. Christian humility, according to Mkhitar in his stories, means to build what you are made to build in the way that is innate to you, without feeling the need to justify yourself or to put down others or to tear down what they have built. Christ said, "Blessed are the humble in heart, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." And how did he describe that kingdom elsewhere? He said, "In my Father's house are many mansions. If it weren't so, I would have told you." There is room in the kingdom, Mkhitar says, for us all to be, and for us all to build, and to enjoy all the things that we know about ourselves, all the traditions and the history, and the wonderful faith that we know we have, and to enjoy them as the people we know we are. It requires only a shift in priority. And so, to quote Mkhitar one last time, his advice for us living multiculturally is this: let us put first the will of God, the one who, because he loves harmonious human life, made us to need one another. And because of that, cities and other common dwelling places were built. The will of the evil one is just the opposite. He desires human beings to be divided by hatred in order that he may do evil all the more easily, just as God does good all the more easily where there is love. A multicultural 12th century Armenian man on the principles of living multiculturally as an Armenian, or in fact, as anyone, in a world where you are not alone, and not everyone, thank God, is like you or me. Thank you.